I'm Howard Blumenthal, executive producer, and very curious about the future of learning in a digital age. Michael Horn, please tell us about yourself.
It's great to be here. First of all, I'm a principal consultant at Entangled Solutions right now, and the co-founder of the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation, where I was the executive director of its education program and now serve as a distinguished fellow there.
So tell us about the connection with Clayton Christensen, because I think a lot of people will know about disruptive innovation, but maybe some won't, and I'm not sure everybody connects that with education.
Yeah, absolutely. So Clay Christensen, the father of disruptive innovation theory, which was this idea that innovations that often trip up really well-run organizations actually don't compete at the outset head-to-head with them. They start on the outside, fringe areas where, in a certain context where the alternative is nothing at all. And so they can start out as primitive, but they enable people to start consuming these in these new contexts through something that's simpler, more affordable, accessible. They get better and better, and over time transform the entire sector into something that's much more accessible to a much greater population. In about 2006, I joined up with Clay Christensen to write what became the book called Disrupting Class, but basically taking his theories, which include disruptive innovation and some other ones around how to more predictably innovate, and basically applying them into the public education system and saying, hey, how can we use these processes to help our schools innovate? And we started the Clayton Christensen Institute as a nonprofit think tank, which I ran the education practice for just under 10 years and applied it in both K-12 and higher education, asking these questions: how can we create a more student-centered system, understanding these forces of innovation?
So I'm suspecting that most people who are listening will know about MOOCs and Coursera, and also about books and public lectures and learning on the internet. And so many of the people on our staff have used YouTube to learn specific software tools, rather than something that would have to come from a professor in another era. So we get all that. The tough part is when you walk onto a college campus, you're still walking into a college campus. It doesn't feel very different. So is there a whole nother way of thinking that hasn't quite approached those old buildings, or is all that happening inside and we're just not seeing it?
I think two things are going on. One of the things that the theory of disruptive innovation shows us is that it's actually really, really hard for the established players to do the disrupting themselves, right? It's counterintuitive. It suggests a whole different set of values that are important to the organization that just doesn't make sense fundamentally for the organization itself to do it. So I think sometimes when we don't see it in the very traditional 4-year grassy quad experience that we might be familiar with, it's because in fact, those places may be the last in many cases to really move into this direction. I think where you really see it taking off is the fact that a huge percentage now of students are actually taking at least one online course as part of their college experience every single year. So that's been a change. And then the second thing that's been a change is you've seen fully online and often competency-based universities start to appear over the last several years that have been enrolling an increasing number of students. And then you look at the boot camp phenomenon that's arisen, General Assembly, Galvanize, organizations like that are really combining online learning with a co-working space. And you're starting to see, I think, glimmers of what this future of education might look like in a more formal setting to give students actual credentials that they can use in the workforce.
So there was a fascinating article in Parallel from Nieman Lab. The headline is NPR decides it won't promote podcasts or NPR One on air. And the reason is because the public radio stations, the individual stations, are objecting to not being involved. So there's an instance, but a lot of us rely upon NPR and public media. In fact, we grow out of public media with this organization. And in particular, we're using puppets as peers with humans, taking on big issues, but we aren't taking them on in linear ways. So there are different ways of thinking about learning. But I was very struck by the fact that the stations and the network were so separated on this issue.
Yeah, and I think it's a classic sign of when you're trying to do something fundamentally disruptive, in this case, meaning, right, it's not resonant with the existing values and processes of the organization. you see that tug sort of pull, and traditionally the way organizations have been able to disruptively innovate is by creating autonomy so that they can make what might seem counterintuitive decisions to the parties that make up the organization. I suspect what you're sort of getting at is the decision to pull back from promoting podcasts or media that might seem competitive with existing stations and local markets is basically the existing value proposition, if you will, winning and not being able to open up to this disruption. The key is to really have a very different decision-making process for these disruptive things and say, hey, we might cannibalize ourselves, but it's better that we cannibalize ourselves better than someone else from the outside.
Well, there's the scary thought, right? So I'm a well-established 100-year-old institution. I have a nice leafy campus, and we keep our standards pretty high. And I'm watching our students take one class every semester, which will become two and three. I'm looking at all these tenured professors and all these fixed costs and more dropouts. People don't tend to stay in college the way they did, and we don't necessarily provide the scaffolding to make that easy, particularly as we're pushing to have more college students come through the quad. So how do you put those pieces together?
The framing is extremely well said. I think you capture the tensions extraordinarily accurately. And it's the question, right? Which is, are universities going to remain the place where they stand and deliver on curriculum that can be recorded, and not necessarily through, MOOC-like online lectures, but through actually much more interesting phenomenon of digital media that allow you to manipulate characters or simulations or things like that. But basically the raw content acquisition. It's been part of what universities do today. Are they going to continue to do that and compete with all this digital media coming up that allows you to do it, quite frankly, more personalized and more efficiently in many? Or are they going to say, hey, that's here, let's absorb that, and let's actually change the nature of what happens inside the walls of the university? And what I mean by that, I'll give you two examples. One, so I spent some time with a well-regarded engineering school, and the big question they were asking themselves is, gee, MOOCs are just proliferating across the spectrum. Is that really what we want to be competing with, or would we rather students come here to campus and they learn online the basic knowledge, and then with the faculty members and their peers, they're doing really rich projects, creating really robust engineering projects, soup to nuts, from project planning to project management, scoping out what they're trying to achieve, and even getting it into market, but doing things with 3D printers and other sorts of stuff that they might not have access to elsewhere. And so that's one way to think about, I think, the change that will be coming, which is universities saying, hey, we can actually get much more hands-on in actually creating things and doing things where humans uniquely have a value proposition as compared to, say, machines that are really good at repeating things over and over again. That's one example. I think a second example is what Minerva Project is doing, which is a new university, liberal arts curriculum, first elite liberal arts university, I think, to launch in the last 100 or so years, based out of San Francisco. And they basically say, the students that come here, we assume you know your knowledge from MOOCs and whatever else online. And when you come here, what we set up online, even as you live face to face, but your courses are actually these really intense active learning online discussions led by professors in seminar format on this online platform that just basically compels you to constantly interact and be involved in the learning experience for the entire duration of the session. So it's a really active seminar experience, way better than anything we ever experienced in college when we were there. That's totally focused on the higher order skills of arguing, debating, analyzing, extracting the really big lessons around system change and things like that from whatever the subject matter happens to be. And so I think those are sort of two decisions that universities, two choices that they can make in thinking about how this future unfolds.
So let's talk about the maker part of it and then the thinker part of it, if you will, right? So the maker part of it, well, I can buy a 3D printer now pretty easily. I just hit the internet and it's here tomorrow. And it used to be, when I was in college, that I needed the equipment, I needed the people, I needed the structure. I don't need that anymore. I have it all, sitting on my phone. So I'm hoping the professors are going to teach me more and my interaction with others would teach me more, but I can simulate that without spending tens of thousands, over $100,000 to get there. There are many ways to do that. So I worry a bit about college is becoming a maker place because there will be so many other maker places, and frankly, makers find ways of making places on their own. It's part of what they do. The thinker part of it sounds really elitist. I'm not sure everybody wants to debate, right? The whole question that we're addressing is, do we produce too many college graduates or not enough? Maybe we're both heading towards, well, maybe we're producing too many. And I hate to be on that side of the equation, but if we're not all going to attend maker centers our whole life, and not everybody wants to engage in debate, thanks, I'd rather watch a baseball game, where does that leave these big campuses? It's really good real estate. It may be that they just sell the real estate off and call it a day.
No, I think you're getting at something right, which is the two experiences I just outlined are definitely at the upper end of the spectrum. And a lot of these campuses, sort of the scenario that you described of this 4-year residence experience, Leafy campus, et cetera, is really at the elite end. And the big new generation of college students, this new normal, formerly called non-traditional student, is often an adult learner, has some college but not a degree, needs some sort of up credentialing to get ahead, might be working or in the caregiving while they're going to college. And so it's just a very different experience. And my sense of that question is, I'll give you another example, Match Beyond, which I think is one of the most fascinating experiments in higher ed going on right now, which is taking Southern New Hampshire University's online curriculum that's competency-based. So you move on as you actually master a concept or skill or whatever. And in theory, you could immediately give a credential, right, for doing that. So we stop talking about degrees and more what you can do in bite-sized chunks that are relevant to employers. And then they put it in a place-based space in downtown Boston, in this case, that takes Match, which is traditionally been a charter school in the K-12 space. So they bring mentors basically to help students stay on task, make sure that they're making progress even as they have other life commitments, and then really helping connect them to employers so that they can take these credentials and actually get a job with them. And the cost of it is $5,000 a year. And so that's a pretty phenomenal innovation where you've taken online competency-based. They are still giving degrees at this point, but I think it's only a matter of time where we start looking at stackable credentials that are much smaller. And so that if a student, comes and doesn't really want the 2 or 4 year degree, they just want a particular skill set, we can start to certify that. Through competency-based, where you're moving on based on mastery as opposed to time, when the professor is going to give the next lecture, you fundamentally change the decision set and the opportunity set of what you're able to give students. So I think that'll be a big piece of it. And then in regards to the real estate, it's a big question, I think. That fixed cost piece is going to be big. If you're a small college in Western Massachusetts without a lot of population density, but a pretty big campus despite that, what happens? And I think you can turn some of that into these flexible co-working spaces where you get to work with your mentor or peers, to keep you moving and on projects or whatever's relevant, right, for the job skill. But I think there is a real serious question of what happens to a lot of the physical plant at some of these universities across the country. And I don't think there's a good answer for that yet.
Well, that's the space dimension. Let's talk about the time dimension for a sec. And I'm going to lead you in a slightly different place that one of our characters, Big Picture, takes on in a big way by asking, why is it that we focus higher education on such a small number of years of an adult life cycle? And I'll give you a very specific example for me. I've become very interested in the American history period that immediately follows the Declaration of Independence but precedes the Constitution, in which we were trying to figure out what the United States would be and how it would operate. And I've read my 5 books by top historians, and I've read anything the web has available, and I'm curious about it. This is not going to become a lifetime passion, but it is something that I'd like to know more about, and I've kind of tapped out the available resources, which frankly are on the thin side. But we're in Philadelphia. There are an enormous number of wonderful American history professors. We have 80 colleges and universities here, but I have no access to them. So somehow we've created a system by which there is knowledge that is proximate and no means of access unless by chance somebody answers an email. That seems profoundly silly considering the amount of money we're spending and what I hope to be a tremendous need for people to be learning all through their lives. We don't make that easy.
Yeah, I agree completely. 2 thoughts occur to me as I hear you say it. One, I've started thinking of the future of college less as a place that you go to for 4 years and more as a entity that you keep coming back to, into and out of, basically as you live life through your whole journey. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, again, the competency-based nature of what we can now do with online learning, of making a time variable but learning constant, allows you to cycle in for, to get a particular skill, fill a particular hunger, whatever it is, for whatever reason it is, and then move out and keep living and then come back in. And there's a driving force that's really important now, and from a workforce perspective, which is a lot of the skills in our economy that make up the workforce are becoming out of date every few years. And so you actually have to keep leveling up. And then there's the other reason, which is the curiosity, growth as a person reason, right, that you're citing. And I think both will be compelling. I really think that college will be much more of this lifelong journey instead of this place that you go to after you graduate high school. The second thing that I think is interesting, admittedly, I've not thought enough about it about higher ed, but just to play off the example you gave, I've been looking for sort of the Airbnb of schooling to pop up. And I've been thinking of it in a K-12 context, but your question makes me think I should think about it in a higher ed one as well, which is there are lots of students and families, quite frankly, who are totally discontent with the current public schooling system, don't want to pay for an elite private school experience, but they do want, a teacher who is a subject matter expert occasionally to come in and work with their kids, and some custodial piece of it is important. They don't want to just do strict homeschooling, right? And so you're seeing pop up in various communities these micro schooling type communities where 10 families, say, get together and rotate, where they learn, where the kids learn. And I just imagine that there could be some sort of platform that connects them to experts that can come in either face to face or online. It depends sort of on the need, right, of whether custodial is important or not, but allows those humans to actually impart the expertise and training that those students need at whatever part of their journey is. And so I guess it's some sort of exchange that facilitates these interactions. I think it's only a matter of time till that pops up, in my opinion. Udemy is doing something like that in the higher ed space, although it's more still from a course perspective as opposed to like, I want to correspond with you and get value out of it. I don't think it's actually that hard to imagine an exchange popping up online that allows you to do what you just said.
And maybe I can find those four professors, and maybe I'm subscribing to a service. Maybe we've got the model wrong. Maybe it isn't about a one-time payment with gigantic debt for individual students who have a tough time paying it back. Maybe it's a lifetime subscription, because I want to be able to access that when I need it, but I don't necessarily need it every year. I need it every 3 years or every 7 years, or when I become interested in X, or when I decide to move to Y. So we don't have anything like that model, but I do wonder about Open University in England, which certainly has pushed far in some of the areas you're talking about and hasn't in others. Could you explain what that's all about and how that might map onto a future?
Yeah, I mean, the Open University in England is fascinating because it's actually relative to the phenomenon we're talking about here so far. It's a much older institution. It's been around for a long time.
1960s, right?
Yeah, that's right, 1960s.
Yeah.
And they basically provide open resources that students can learn from in a much more flexible way. It's still framed in a traditional university context, so you can get a degree by assessment, as I understand it, but it fundamentally flips the model on its head, and it relies on open resources. And adjunct is the wrong word for the faculty members. University of the People has done this as well, where it's more of a flexible, not quite volunteer. There's some pay for the professors, right? But they're more in and out of the experience as demand creeps up for the students. It's a much lower cost experience as a result. You can keep coming back to it as you need to continue to skill up. It's not elite. It doesn't have standards of admission, and it's truly open, which I think is neat.
And it's very local.
It's very local in the sense, yeah, of who it serves, right? And University of the People, which is in many ways modeled after that, it's a newer university, has tried to do the same thing sort of on a global scale.
So why don't we have Open University in the United States? Any thoughts?
I think it's a couple reasons. One, traditionally, accreditation has been the model through which we have allowed universities to come into existence and operate and attract federal dollars. You have to have accreditation to get federal dollars, which has, for better or worse, become the lifeline of a lot of institutions. And accreditors are fundamentally made up of they're membership organizations made up of peer institutions who, when they look at whether a university is doing a good job, they look at, do you look like the rest of us? And so they look at your libraries and they look at how much of your faculty are PhDs and things of that nature, which is not conducive to the sort of open innovation that Open University or others have promulgated. It creates a big tension and I think a block in moving this forward. And then the other piece is, this notion of competency based, where you move on as you master, as opposed to, today the professor's teaching this, so guess that's what I'm listening to. That model is still not really funded, except for a few experimental sites like Southern New Hampshire University, Western Governors University. It's not widespread in the U.S., and people feel uncomfortable with how you think about quality at scale in that model. So that's really what's held it up.
So let's say, I mean, you seem like a bright fellow. I'm going to give you all the money you need to create what you think we ought to have here as a model that you think will have legs. How much money do you need, and what are you going to do with it?
Yeah, I actually don't know that we need tons of money. My sense is that what we need is a few different organizations, right, that are going to start this. So I think one is the Match Beyond model that I talked about earlier. I think I would love to see a much bigger proliferation and build out of that across cities across America. And that's the open competency-based, but very local model. I'd love to see that get blown out. I'd put more money into developing better online competency-based programs that have more scaffolding in them to support learners, not just sort of the wild west of MOOCs with better instructional design behind them. And then the third thing I would do is on the elite end, which is to craft more. I think part of the reason that we're held up, I think, in this country is we look at the elite end of this and we say that's what college is, and therefore that's what real college is, and it sort of traps us. I would create more models at the elite end, or at least at the high priced end, that are much more plugged into this vision that we're talking about, that's more flexible, open, tailored around people's lives over their entire lives, and thinking about that as college, just to shift the model around what this overall ecosystem looks like. And the last thing I would do is I would really move beyond degrees. I think credentialing or badging or nano degrees or whatever we want to call them, but basically anytime someone is learning something, giving them credit for it and something that they can use that stands a true test of being real makes a lot more sense to supporting this lifelong learning structure that we've talked about.
Yeah, but what about that Ivy League kid who comes in for a job interview with me, and the first line on his resume is his GPA?
Yeah.
What do you do
Well,
with that? What do you do with that kind of thinking, right?
well, it turns out the GPA is one of the most inaccurate and unhelpful metrics, right, in the world of predicting job success. And right now, if you think about it, when a student comes into an interview, they bring with them essentially 3, maybe 4 data points about them. And you think about that in our world, right, of how much data has proliferated and opportunities to capture real authentic student work and things like that. And they're basically bringing a few data points with them, right? They're bringing the university they went to, the GPA, a few references, maybe their SAT score. That is a really terrible way to hire. It's pretty inadequate. We know that at the best case scenario, 50% or so of hiring works. So I think honestly, this has to tie into employers to show a much richer way of hiring. And what I think is interesting in the tech world is how many of those companies are moving away from hiring based on GPA and where you went to school, and much more of, let me actually see your work. Can you do what we do here? What's the portfolio of things you've done? If teamwork is important, how do you work with teams? Let me see projects in which you've done that, and things of that nature. And I think, again, the badging world, I think, is totally consistent with this. It's going to move the conversation into a very different place, and it'll come from 2 angles. One, it'll come from this tech angle that has an elite angle to it, which will be good to tackling the question you just asked. And then the second thing is, I think, other jobs where we can very clearly quantify what success looks like and what the skills are you need to deliver on it, which in many cases may be lower end parts of the economy historically. I think that's where this will advance. And, it may take some time before we cut into the liberal arts major like myself, who has a history degree and, picks a more qualitative job, if you will, that it's harder to measure. And that's okay. Innovation is never an event. It's always a process. And in this case, I think it's a generational one.
So you think this is a 25-year process, a 50-year process?
Yeah, I do. I don't think it's going to turn over very quickly at all. And I think for a long time, even as it is turning over, and as they say, the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. There'll be many, many students going through a pretty traditional experience still. And you know what? When they leave, then they'll start to go into this new experience as it becomes important for them.
So I'm the Latina first generation struggling through my freshman, sophomore year with family issues all around me, without enough money, having to work a proper job as well as being in college. And I'm doing everything I can to not slip and slide out of place.
Hmm.
So the statement you just made sounds great. 25, 50 years out. What do I do today?
Yeah, this is why the match beyond question you asked and things of that nature that I think we're just at the beginning of. I think we need programs that, again, take the online competency-based experience and then real mentorship, really helping put a team around these students. I'm very encouraged by the rise of learning relationship management platforms, companies like Fidelis Education that basically offer a Facebook type platform that says, hey, what are your goals? What are you actually trying to achieve? And then helps put people actually around you to support you in that journey and understand the things that are going to trip you up and help keep you on task, help you stay motivated, and help block and tackle on those other parts of your life. I think that's going to be a huge part of that question. And the good news is those are starting to grow, but I would be looking at universities that are making a serious investment in mentorship and teams around you to help you deal with life and stay on track to your goal. And if a university is not thinking about that side of it, given the increasing diversity of our higher ed population and the different needs that each student will bring as a result, I think they're really missing one of the realm that will be so important to unlocking student success.
And it's my responsibility to come up with that goal, or does that college or university give me a little checklist and I'll say I'll take one of those and one of those?
So it's a combination, right? Of there's a whole bunch of tests out there that help through personality, likes, things that you enjoy doing, help you find the things that are most likely to get you excited and passionate, right? And so they help narrow choices, but then also talking to the people who are actually in those fields. And again, these platforms should be connecting to real professionals who can tell you what their lives are like. How much money do they make? What's the day-to-day experience? What's the good of it? What's the bad of it? What courses or skills do you need to develop to be able to be successful in it? Making that much more transparent upfront to scaffold students into making smart decisions is really, really important. And we're in the early stages of some pretty interesting research right now about understanding why and how students make decisions around where they go to college. That takes a very different spin from a lot of others. And the interesting thing is so many students, the reason they go to college, honestly, is they don't have a real reason. It's just sort of the logical next step of what else am I supposed to do? So I did that. And I think the interesting question for a post-secondary program is, okay, if that's the entering point, how do I take that student and within 10 weeks quickly expose them to lots of different opportunities to awaken a passion and help them go there? Move them on to a more purposeful reason that they're here and pursuing this education.
Big job.
Big job. We have a lot of work to do, but the pieces are starting to come together. But it is the early days. I just don't think we should delude ourselves otherwise.
Yeah, that makes it fun, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all this. Much appreciated. I hope everybody who listened to it enjoyed it as much as I did. Good provocative questions, good provocative answers. So we appreciate it.